This morning, hope everyone's had a good week. So this morning we're going to carry on with Ken Butterworth's book on Plain Bible Talk, and as you can see from the title slide, this morning we're looking at evolution. And interestingly enough, the book didn't really have a lot of information on evolution. It was really just a bunch of questions and really asking logical, common sense questions that you would ask if you're genuinely interested in finding out whether or not evolution is true. And so what I did was I preached a lesson on it about, actually I should have looked before I came up here. Anyways, it was about 3 years ago. And so when I kind of got to the end of the framework for this lesson, I thought, well, I'm going to put my lessons in here because essentially I'd be done in 5 minutes. And I searched high and low, I could not find my lessons. But in searching high and low for all my lessons, I found a lesson that Brother Glenn Tattersall presented. And now when Glenn presented it, he actually presented it at the family camp many, many years ago. And I had the Word document, and obviously we're doing this in PowerPoint presentation. Stop looking at your watch, Keegan. And so I took all his work and I converted it to PowerPoint. And I was thinking to myself, every slide that I was putting in is like, I've done this, I've looked in, I've researched these things. So anyways, spent about 2 hours converting this Word to PowerPoint. And I was just about to send it to Lena, and I thought, I'm going to give this one last go. I'm going to go right to the highest level of my structure, filing structure, and look one last time. And lo and behold, I found it. So I then put it all in. So you've got 47 slides that I got to get through. No, just kidding. So I've left his in because I couldn't get myself to take it out after doing all that work. But we will go from sort of the framework and the questions that Ken Butterworth puts forward, which really, if at our level, may or may not be enough, depending on your level of curiosity. But I'm going to go through some of the scientific evidences as well, talking about evolution. Is it a viable theory? Is it a fact? Has it been proven? Etc. And if we have some time, I'll flick through some of the more interesting points that Glenn did raise, especially Glenn took a bit more time to go into professor quotes and things like that on either side of the argument, and that's quite interesting because then you get super educated people weighing in on the subject, and it's interesting to see how they fall either side of that. So the purpose is to expose the theory of evolution as a false teaching. The goal is to learn that the theory of evolution contradicts not only the foundation of the Bible, but also scientific facts. I thought this was a pretty interesting thought. Elvis is alive and God is dead. That's kind of this idea or a principle behind evolution. Like, you have people that are quite willing to believe that Elvis is still alive and hiding somewhere, as that article says, but there's no God. Whereas all the evidence to both are quite contrary. So, choices is that God is eternal, either God is eternal, or matter is eternal and laws are not. And this is actually more significant than what you potentially realize. Maybe a lot of you read that and recognize the sort of the weight to that statement, but that is really the statement, because those are your two. You have to pick one of these. Atheist, theist, Christian, non-Christian, half a believer, lukewarm, fire, cold, whatever. You are going to have to pick one of these. Because if the earth evolved and there is no God, matter has to be eternal. It had to always be there. It has to always be there. Or there is a God who is eternal. So even when you talk about, or when you think about at least, speaking to people, why do you believe in God? You can as logically say, why do you believe in earth? Because if you do not believe in God, you have to believe that the earth is eternal. And you might say, or your response might be, well, that's easy. I can look outside and see earth. I can't look outside and see God. But we will look at the fact that just seeing the earth doesn't mean it's eternal. There's got to be something more to it. We're going to get into that. But that's why this is such an important choice to consider. You have to believe one of these. Three great truths. There is a creator. All was created by him and for him. and evolution is a false teaching from the devil. Now, that's very easy for me to say that, but we're going to look at whether or not they are truths through the time that we have. Key scriptures. So, I'm not going to spend too much time in the key scriptures because ultimately, I suppose in a sense, you're using the Bible to prove the Bible. And that's not a valid truth. I mean, even Jesus recognizes that, right? He says, I bear witness to myself, but if only I bear witness to myself, it's not a valid testimony. So he needed other people to bear witness to him, and that's why there was John, that's why there was the Holy Spirit, that's why there were miracles, that's why we have the apostles, that's why we have all this documentation. All of history testifies to Christ. If Christ alone spoke of and to and about himself, his testimony wouldn't mean anything because it's just him making statements about him. I can make statements about me, but how does that prove anything? So Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 2 obviously talks about the creation. In the Psalms, there's very many Psalms where David and others represent and talk about how the Lord created all things. Probably not up here, I don't think. No, it's not, because that's the last Psalm reference. Psalm 121, I always think of that because that's my dad's favorite one. He used to come from the NG, which is an Afrikaans church, and he said that he always remembered the preacher would stand up and in Afrikaans, it would always open up with, look up to the hills, where does my help come from? But in Afrikaans, it translates sounding a lot more powerful and impactful than that. But Psalm 121, where I look up to the hills, where does my help come from? My help comes from God, the maker of the hills, of heavens and earth. That's who we look up to. So the Psalms are full of these scriptures about how God created the world with his word, with his mouth, with his power. John 1, 1 through 5, again, this testimony to Jesus, the fact that he was the word, that he was there in the beginning, he was with God, he was God, and all things were created by him and for him. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. I don't know if anybody actually took me up on that plug that I put in for the YouTube video on this particular verse, but certainly this is a very powerful verse. So I would like to just read this one. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. A really powerful verse as to the power and the awesomeness of the God that we serve. And seeing I have my Bible open, Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, it reads, traitors, is this the correct verse? Yeah. Oh, it's because I'm in Timothy. Let's try that again. For every house is built by someone, but he who has built all things is God. And really, I included that one in these key scriptures because there's sort of a bit of an evidence in that one in and of itself. You look at a house and you don't think, oh wow, look what just evolved out of the ground. After millions of years, this structure came to be in an organized and designed fashion. No, you look at a house and you recognize someone built the house. But God created all things. So some obvious questions that are posed in this book. We have monkeys, we have humans. Why is there not even any fossils of man monkeys? Where did space dust come from? So if you go to, and Shannon and I actually sat through one of these, we had a good giggle. If you go to, SATEC. If you go to SATEC in the city, you can actually sit, I don't know if they still do it, but they did when my kids were young and we got free passes through school. You sit in this sort of like dome-shaped theater and it talks about how evolution just is. It's just a fact, it just happened. And it all started with space dust. Well, where did the space dust come from? And for me, the most amusing thing about that whole video was there was space dust and a whole bunch of things happened. And then what actually created life were these little organisms that had sort of grown. And then they specifically said this, and these node-type things are designed. I was like, well, hold on. Where did the design come from? How were they designed to do anything? Who designed them? So yeah, both Shane and I and Talon, I think that was a bit young, just burst out laughing when we heard that. Anyways, another question Probably for Christians who try and fit their belief into this theory of evolution because it's so prominent. If Genesis 1 was epochs of time, which is the suggestion to try and consolidate evolution with Christianity just because it's so pronounced in the world today, how did plants survive without the sun for these generations? Plants were created before the sun was created. How did they survive for thousands of years? How did they survive without insects? Insects were only created 3, epochs of time later, if that's what your thoughts is. So there were no bees to pollinate. There were no insects to help nature survive. How did that all happen? Over thousands of years. How old was Adam when he died? If he was 930 years old when he died, based on the 7-day, which is what the Bible indicates the 7 days were, even if you look at the Sabbath being the 7th day that the Jews are to keep holy, if those are actually epochs of time, Adam wouldn't have been 930 years old. He'd have had to be 930,000 something years old. So again, it does not fit. Trying to fit a false teaching into a true teaching just because the majority of the world now wants to believe that evolution is true doesn't make it a true teaching. All right, so that was pretty much the end of the book. It was really just these questions of, well, if evolution is real, how does all this work? And a few scriptures showing that God created things, but like I said, if you're using the Bible to prove the Bible, it feels a little mute to myself. So this is sort of where I kicked in, where the lesson I presented was, creation demands a creator, and sort of a quarter way into it, this is the question I posed. How can you know? How can you know there is a God? How can you know there is a creator? Before we looked at that question in the lessons, how do you know that God does not exist? So often we're told or asked, the burden of proof is on us, and you're going to see that in the next point that gets raised there. You're often asked, how do you know that God exists? And an equally fair question is then to ask, how do you know that God does not exist? So if I'm expected to prove that God does exist, you should be expected to prove that he does not exist, because either is a point on which you have to stand, and so therefore either should be able to be proved in some manner. It is impossible to prove that God does not exist. And we might look at that principle later, depending on the time that we have. But I want to keep the burden of proof on us at the moment. So what I mean by that is, I can logically and fairly say, well, I will prove that God exists when you prove that he doesn't exist. But essentially all I'm then saying is, okay, well, I'm going to leave you with all the work to go and prove that he doesn't exist because I'm tired of this argument, which in some cases may be fair. In some cases you may just be tired. There's been a lot of cases in my life where I've just thought, no, it's just not worth the effort that this is going to take to get no result. But for the sake of the fact that I'm actually speaking to people who do want to know the truth, I'm assuming that's why you woke up early-ish this morning, to be here this morning, to hear some form of truth. Let's keep the burden of proof in our court, and let's look at how can we prove that God exists. So the one thing you do have to believe, and I found many years ago, when I really started going into this idea of apologetics and proving that God exists, I stumbled across a series of lessons, and the first point in that lesson was John Clayton. Some of you may know him or know of his series. He asks, I merely ask you to believe that you exist. And he goes on to explain how this may seem like a stupid statement to make. Well, obviously I believe I exist. I'm standing right in front of you talking to you. But there are people who go down this psychological route and theory of, well, do we really exist? Are we some part of a matrix that's out there? We're actually in this John Wachowski universe and we don't actually exist, and this is all just a construct of some whatever. That's just not going to go there. All right. So if you believe you exist, if you're happy to confirm with me that we are existing, then we recognize, okay, well, matter exists. This is not some dream state or anything. This is real. This is real life. We're in real life today. And if matter exists, then we can start asking the questions, okay, well, where did it come from? Now we can start. So it is quite an important step to understand that you exist. And if you exist, then matter exists. And if matter exists, where did the matter come from? And that really leads us to matter demands a maker. I'm not going to go into reading all of that. I sort of summarized it on the day. I'm not even going to do that now. But essentially, the law of cause and effect means something has to have a maker. And to go into that a little bit, in Britannica, which is really why I've got that up there, I went into their website and looked at the laws of Newton. And really, Newton is probably our biggest friend when it comes to proving the existence of God, because he has created, or not created, let's rephrase, rewind. He discovered the laws that we have in play today that allows us really to do almost everything that we do. In fact, everything that we do. And the first law is the law of inertia. Bodies tend to remain at the state that they're in unless acted upon by an outside force, is a short version for that one. The second formula, force equals mass times acceleration. So this is really the quantitative change that happens upon an object or upon matter when a force acts upon it. So if I roll a ball across the stage, if there is no friction, it will just keep moving. There will be no reason for it to stop. That's the first law. The second law is when it's stopped, a force has acted on it to stop it, and that force is directly related to that object's mass and the acceleration at which was in play. And so we know it's going to stop. If I roll a tennis ball here very slowly, it will stop before it gets to the end because friction has acted upon it, and that force has caused it to stop. And that's a law. It'll happen every time exactly the same way. You can do it 1 billion, 1 trillion, a number that I can't pronounce times. It will happen exactly the same every time. And the third law is of action and reaction. So in essence, it's very similar to the law of cause and effect. The action that happens, the reaction is in line with that force. And it's a real force. It's not just a theory or bookkeeping force. It's something that is actually there. If a flower lands on the pulpit, it's not going to fall over. There's just not enough of the flower to cause the pulpit to fall over. But if I take a step back and I give this a good kick, besides, I think, Walter reciprocating the action on my bum, this pulpit's going to fall over. And my reaction, the pulpit's reaction, and Walter's reaction will all be equivalent to the matter that is sustained, the result of the action. So, interesting. There was an investigation done. I'm not going to go into that right now, but everyone remember one of these? Hey. I remember when I put this up, I showed my kids this. They're like, what's this? They're like, oh, we don't know. All right, so that's what we used to use to find people's telephone numbers. Okay, anyone recognize this? That's a little different. Okay, I don't know what that is either. I can't remember. No, just kidding. It's the formula for the first law of thermodynamics. And essentially, things want to return to equilibrium. Everything in nature, everything in the universe wants to conform to a state of equilibrium. Nothing wants to become unbalanced. So if I put a glass of cold water on this pulpit, it will eventually warm up because the surrounding is warm. And it's not going to magically cool down unless something happens on the outside that cools it down. And then it'll cool down because, again, it wants to be in the state of equilibrium. So that's a very summarized version of the law of thermodynamics. And that's really what that formula relates to, the delta and how it wants to come back to the zero delta. Nature wants to be equal. And we're not talking about laws here where it says 70 outside, but I can drive 80 kilometers an hour. You know, I can drive 80 kilometers an hour and nothing's going to happen except I might get a speed fine if there's a camera somewhere. But I can do it. I can drive right out here and go 80 k's an hour on the 70 k an hour zone. But the law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity, you can't break those laws. I can't walk off that step and not fall to the ground. I can't jump off a 20-story building and not hit the pavement unless I have a jetpack on or a red cape. No, not even a red cape. It's just going to happen. You cannot break those laws. The laws of nature are unbreakable. Remember this? I used to love these guys. Anyways, so, he wouldn't hang around there. He's going to fall. One, because it was very funny, and two, because it's the law of nature. Gravity is going to act upon the coyote, and he is going to hit the ground and not die, because that law doesn't count in cartoon world. But in real world, he's not going to make it, because that's the law of nature. So, here's an interesting one from Stephen Hawkins. Where does the hydrogen come from? The answer, Big Bang. But here's the crucial bit. The law of nature itself tells us that not only could the universe have popped into existence without any assistance, like a proton, and having required nothing in terms of energy, but also that it is possible that nothing caused the Big Bang. Nothing. Now, essentially, he's contradicting himself in the exact same sentence, because there is nothing happens when there is nothing. That's the law of thermodynamics. And so, Stephen Hawkins, whatever his IQ level is, that is a really stupid statement, because nothing causes nothing. In every way that you read that, whether it be nothing causes nothing or nothing is nothing, if there's nothing, your result is nothing. I don't know if it's still on, there was a show on Netflix called A Trip to Infinity. Weird stuff going on there. But anyways, so this guy, Anthony Aguirre, he's, as you can see there, a professor, way smarter than what I'll ever be. But he says if you take a peach, or an apple, I think that's an apple, sorry. If you take an apple and you put it in a box, forever, it's going to rot, decompose, eventually disintegrate. Now, interesting that it follows this process, which is the laws of thermodynamics. It's going to reach an equilibrium. The living is going to die because there is nothing to sustain it. It is going to decompose because that is natural. It's going to look to the state of natural equilibrium. But then what he says is that eventually the atoms and the particles in this box, with some monumental, it's basically just a big Rubik's Cube, and if you just keep turning that Rubik's Cube, these atoms and these particles, enough times, a fresh apple is going to reappear. And so I have to ask the question, is that beyond a reasonable doubt that that is going to happen? I'd say there's a massive doubt that that is going to happen. And I will skip closer towards the end if I haven't got there yet, because one of the things I did enjoy about Brother Glenn's lesson was he spoke about impossibility and possibility and what are the scientific ratios before something is determined to be impossible. And then they ran the computation of what are the odds of something like that happening. What are the odds of creation? What are the odds of life from non-life, etc. So I will jump to that slide towards the end. But like, this is impossible stuff. But this is what smart people tell you. Educated people tell you that if you put an apple here and you wait 465 billion trillion years, it's going to reappear as an apple, because the particles are going to all of a sudden come back together and be just that juicy, nutritional providing apple again. Smart people tell you this. You believe that God is eternal. Why can I not believe that the universe is eternal? The second law of thermodynamics. So exactly that idea. Once you've broken an egg and scrambled it, you cannot unscramble it. You cannot even do it naturally, let alone wait until eventually the shell particles and the yolk particles and the whatever the white stuff is called particles come back together and magically form a whole uncracked perfect egg. It's not possible. The law of thermodynamics tell you that it's not possible. It's beyond possible doubt. The second law states that heat cannot move from a reservoir of a lower temperature to a higher temperature in a cyclic process. Rudolf Clausius, a physicist who first formulated the law, stated that cyclic transformation, whose only final result is to transfer heat from a body at a given temperature to a body at a higher temperature is impossible. The law describes the amount of work that can result from the transfer of heat. In other words, if I take something that's hotter than this room and I put it down here, it's going to cool to the temperature of the room. There's nothing, it's not going to get hotter. And vice versa. If I put something colder than the room in the room, what's going to happen is that which is cold, as I mentioned, the glass of cold water, it's going to suck the heat from the room. The room is actually going to cool down in accordance with how cold that drink is and the space in the room. Simply put, the second law of thermodynamics, colder things can't make things hotter, and hotter things can't make things colder. A system moved into chaos cannot spontaneously return to its original state. Things want to be at an equal temperature. It is because of the second law of thermodynamics that we even have a Big Bang theory. The irony is they actually rely on this law to provide an answer to where the energy of the universe comes from. But then they break it in every other aspect of their theory. Scientists agree that the universe had to have a beginning and will end. It had to have a beginning and it will end. And I prayed this and I put this up last time. I can't remember. Someone in here is actually related to this person. I think it's Rosie. Is Rose here? Yeah, is it your... Oh, okay, then it's not. Someone came up to me after I presented this and said, oh, that's my niece. So there you go. She's from Sydney. And she is talking about how it is that many times impossible for this idea of creation, of the Big Bang Theory to happen. Anyways, I played that. I'm not going to play it this time. So life demands a life giver. And this was actually pretty incredible. That's very tiny. If you've got binoculars or phones and you want to zoom in, you can read it. But essentially, while the hypothetical process of spontaneous generation was disproved as early as the 17th century and decisively rejected by the 19th century, abiogenesis has been neither proved nor disproved. Did you pick that up? Listen to it again. While the hypothetical process of spontaneous generation was disproved as early as the 17th century and decisively rejected in the 19th century, it has neither been proved nor disproved. Like this is university material. I find that hope very scary. Yeah.
Sorry, if I could just quibble a bit and give it some context. When they talk about spontaneous generation in this sort of sphere, it's about the idea of, I forget the guy's name back in the 16th century or something.
Louis Pasteur.
Yeah.
I'm going to come there.
Put meat in, sold something into a container, and maggots. Look, spontaneously generated maggots. Well, that sort of idea of spontaneous generation from the meat, that's the sort of thing that's been debunked there because they know flies come away, they eat,
Correct.
etc. So they know there's a mechanism, and so things don't just come out of nothing like that, and that's why.
Yeah, so that's what abiogenesis is,
Yeah.
and like you just said, they found the reason, and then Louis Pasteur, which we're going to look at in just a second, did a proper test, and there was no life, and that's why it says then in the 19th century it was educationally or academically rejected, but then they go on in the next sentence to say that it's neither been disproved or proved. So they've literally disproved it, and then in the same sentence they go to say it's neither been disproved or proved. So, there you go, I did actually bring it up. So there you go, so that's Louis Pasteur in the 19th century. He went and he did these exercises with special swan neck flasks so that nothing could get in and there was no life. So, nor disproved, yeah, so disproved, legally unfalsifiable, speculative. So examples, prove that pigs will never be able to fly. So you can't prove that pigs will never be able to fly. You can't disprove something that doesn't yet exist. It's for that reason. You cannot prove that pigs will never fly, as an example of that. Prove this, okay, so we've used this poor pulpit enough times. George Wald, so small, did I really not bring this stuff bigger? Okay. When it comes to the origin of life, there are only two possibilities, creation or spontaneous generation. So interesting. So George Wald says there is only, and he was a staunch atheist, he says there's only two possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. Now, we've just seen how in the 19th century spontaneous generation was disproved by Louis Pasteur and his experiments. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was, there you go, was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads to only other conclusions, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Oh, so he's just deciding philosophically we can't accept that. So there's two options. One was disproved, but philosophically we can't accept that. So sorry. And these are educated people. He was a Nobel laureate, this guy, by the way. He won a Nobel Prize. Super educated. Very smart thing to say. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. So that's just his choice. I mean, that really, when you think about this, it doesn't even make sense. These are guys that want to prove there is no God, there is no creation, and this is the best that they can come up with. Super, super educated people, this is the best that they come up with. A plumber like myself looks at this and thinks, what? The quote mine project, again, very large text. I don't know how I did that, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to skip that. What did I write there? Not approved, not proven. Oh, okay. So let's look at the first sentence there. I think I've got a few things in here. We'll just look at the ones I've got. So our present concept of the origin of life leads to the position that in the universe composed as ours, life inevitably arises wherever conditions permit. That's not proven. It's not proven that just wherever conditions permit, life arises. If you take, like Louis Pasteur did, in fact, it's been disproven, not been proven, it's been disproven. Louis Pasteur created the perfect environment for there to be life of on a microorgasmic scale, and nothing happened. So it's actually disproved, let alone not proven. And then we look at the next sentence. We look upon life as part of the order of nature. It does not emerge immediately out of the establishment of that order. Long ages must pass before it appears. Yet given enough time, it is an inevitable consequence of that order. So how can he make that statement? It's like saying, well, pigs will one day fly. Well, okay, how do you talk to that? That's a random hypothesis that is most likely never going to happen, but I cannot prove that it's not going to happen. That's exactly what that sentence is. So how do you look at this realistically beyond a reasonable doubt? If any of these things were in a courtroom, it would just, we've got a lawyer in our midst, so better be careful, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a lesson on courtroom tactics after this. But just kidding. Seriously, when you look at these statements, when you look at these very educated people making these statements that are so clearly false, there's so much doubt. Forget beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just so many things that are said that are just plain false, not true, or go against every law in nature that we have. The law of cause and effect, the law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, the law of biogenesis, that's a law that's been proven in accordance with the educational and academic standards for having a law being embedded into whatever that process, into that academic process. You know, you have that versus the theory of evolution, the theory of biogenesis, and even that I put that in question marks because that's actually been disproved in the 1900s, 1890. And the theory of atoms organizing themselves. Like there's nowhere do we see atoms organizing themselves. If they organize themselves, I mean, even that in and of itself demands intelligence. I heard someone once say, in the idea of whether or not God exists, why does life want to survive? There's no reason for life to survive. And if there is a reason for life to survive, well, who gave it that reason? Why is that common sense that life must survive? Because again, that's a motive. Where did the motive come from? Again, that demands intelligence. So beyond a reasonable doubt. So some of the quotes that I just wanted to put up that Glenn mentioned. So claims of evolutionists, all reputable scientists have agreed that evolution of life on Earth is an established fact. Well, that's not true. And he throws a very, I think, undisguised jab. All reputable scientists. Oh, so because I believe that evolution can't exist, I'm no longer a reputable scientist. And obviously, I'm not a scientist to anything. But we're going to look at some very, very reputable scientists that do believe that evolution is not possible. But because they don't, in this guy's, Dr. Vance's mind, they're obviously no longer reputable. Evolution after Darwin, Sir Julian Huxley said the first point to make about Darwin's theory is that it is no longer a theory but a fact. No serious, again, no serious. Oh, you say that, well, you can't be a serious scientist. Would deny the fact that evolution has occurred. Evolution is a fact, like apples falling out of a tree. Right. Dr. Richard Goldsmith, evolution of the animal and plant world is considered by all those entitled to a judgment, again we have that little phrase there, to be a fact for which no further proof is needed. Please don't question me, I'm tired of answering your questions. The occurrence of evolution of life in this history of the earth is established about as well as events not witnessed by human observers can be established. Okay, go get him, Tiger. So scientific method. So for the scientific method, it must be observable. There must be a statement and a definition of the problem, and then they would form a hypothesis. And that hypothesis then needs to be tested over and over and over, and then it can be established as fact. So that's the scientific method. So there's experiments, and then the formation of the theory or the law. So the theory is broadly based. A law reflects actual regularities in nature, to which there are no known exceptions. That's the law. So now we have the converse. Evolution is not a fact of science. So Dr. Richard Milken, Nobel, sorry for the spelling, Nobel laureate in physics. Obviously, he's not entitled to a judgment, and obviously he's not a reputable scientist. He got lucky with the Nobel Prize. The pathetic thing is that we have scientists who are trying to prove evolution, which no scientist can ever prove. Biologists are simply naive when they talk about experiments designed to test the theory of evolution. It is not testable. I have come to the conclusion that Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program. It is therefore important to show that Darwinism is not a scientific theory, but metaphysical. Creationism, not a fact of scientists, not a fact of science. I'm going to skip some of these. I did want to, this is not a fact of science. Law of probability. So I did want to raise this here. In an event that has a chance of occurring, an event has a chance of occurring if the probability is less than 1 to the 10 to the power of 50. So 10 to the power of 50 is kind of where scientists have said, okay, that's impossible. It's just, there's too low a chance for it to ever happen. Dr. Marcel Schutzenberger, I hope I pronounced that correct, professor of mathematics at the University of Paris, used supercomputers in his day to estimate the probability of life evolving. The computer jammed, indicating that the chances were less than 1 in 10 to the power of 1,000. Carl Sagan estimated that the chance of life evolving on any given single planet like Earth is 1 chance in 1 times 10 to the power of 2 billion. So we're not talking about probabilities here. The reasonable doubt argument it's not even there. Brethren, really, when you're talking about evolution, there is no evolution. We serve a God who created us in his image to serve and to honor him. And really, that's all I hope that you get out of this morning's lesson, is that you walk away recognizing that what we're serving, whom we're serving, the power that we're worshiping, is not just some fairy tale because we've got nothing better to do on a Sunday. We recognize when we look outside that this world, that this circle of life all points to God. And I want to close off with Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through 26. And that was my scripture reading when I did this lesson those years ago. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. You see, if there is a God, he sent his Son. And if he sent his Son, he loved you so much that he sent his only Son to save your soul. And that love demands a response. And that response is what all these clever people are hiding from, because they do not want to recognize that there is an accountability for their actions. And it's sad. It is really sad to know that they can have this joy and this fullness that they're so desperately looking for, but so fiercely running from. We have that truth. We can rest in the fact that we know there is a God. He is alive, and we have eternal life in him. So thank you very much for your attention this morning. We'll close in a word of prayer.